Literally rabbit in the headlights. I've always loved surprises. That feeling when something incredible catches you off guard, sucks you into another world for a moment and makes you laugh or say wow. Like magic. I'm Morwenna, and I'm here to talk to you today about the art of surprise and how getting it right can engage and delight your players or really hack them off if you get it wrong. A bit about me. I love games, video, tabletop, sports, you name it, anything that involves adventure or play or exploration. And I especially love weird stuff because it's inherently surprising. I'm a senior engineering manager at Unity on the multiplayer technology team. And outside of my job, I'm a fledgling developer and recent graduate of the Indie Games Development Program at Falmouth University's Games Academy, which that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. So all views, etc., are my own. I finally emerged from my last 2 years of essentially hermiting through a full-time job and study. And so today I'll be telling you a bit about what I learned through the process of writing my research thesis, for which I squeaked a high distinction. Yay. Whoop, whoop. In today's session, which will last about 45 minutes, depending on how quickly I talk, we'll be talking about the importance of design, of surprise in games, and treading what I learned was a very fine line between delighting and infuriating players. We'll talk about the foundation of research the study was built on, including how surprising events affect people, and consequently why it's a useful tool that you can lean on in your developer's toolbox, how you can create surprises by better understanding the way that the human brain creates assumptions, and then the study itself, what I did, what I learned, and how I'll be applying that learning in future projects. Some caveats. I've worked in games and the adjacent industries for 10 years now, but my research is part of a brand new shiny MA. So I'll be being very clear about the scope and the limitations of this work, which I wrote over the course of 6 months last year. And I'll be presenting the results as truths within the context of this study and beliefs that I hold as a result. So some of what I say might feel a bit Captain Obvious. If you're a developer, you'll probably either be familiar with some of the concepts that I talk about, or perhaps have made design decisions that align with them because they felt right. As I conducted my research, that's how a lot of these things felt for me, a lot of like, light bulb, that's why that thing felt like the right choice. If that's the case for you too, then hopefully some of what I tell you will help you to better articulate and validate those design decisions and provide some language and a framework within which to discuss the design of surprising events with other people. So let's talk a bit about context. Surprise is a crucial part of what it is to be entertained. It is rooted in innovation, newness, and the unexpected. Surprise makes you sit up and pay attention, drawing you away from external distractions. When you're truly surprised, you become alert, focused, and the rest of the world disappears. Our relationship with surprise and our enjoyment of it is built into our very nature. We're so driven by our physiology and our enjoyment of surprise that the pleasure centers of the brain are actually triggered even during unpleasant ones. In the context of games where we're bombarded by innovation constantly, creating surprising experiences can be quite challenging. Newness and innovation in technology and experience have come to be player expectations, and our desire for delight through innovation is a driver of our buying habits, and its presence strengthens consumer loyalty. While productions with larger budgets have the advantage of being able to lean on innovative wow moments created with technological developments, better graphics, higher player counts, faster, more connected experiences, bigger worlds, telling strange and surprising stories is a space where brave developers can perhaps still gain an edge and capture an audience with artistic innovation. Let's start by talking a little bit more about surprise and its effects. Sensitivity to change is encoded into the biology of all animals. It's triggered by events which are unfamiliar unexpected or contravene expectations from past experiences. Surprise is the feeling of amazement, wonder, or astonishment that arises from events like this, usually ones that we perceive to have a low probability of occurrence. When humans are surprised, physiological responses occur in the body that prepare that person to fight or for flight. Not always the response that you hope for when you say throw someone a surprise party, but this is where what happens next comes from. Raising the eyebrows, widening the eyes are thought to be universal responses, and other changes include an increase in heart rate and in skin conductance, where the skin momentarily becomes a better conductor of electricity, which is found to be a strong predictor of attention and memory. Unexpected or surprising events also trigger a surge of chemicals in your brain, a neuromodulator that again increases alertness, heightens attention. The result is increased mental focus, better learning, and improved memory. Another interesting response is a behavioral phenomenon called the orienting reflex, identified by Eugene Sokolov. Hello, Eugene. The orienting reflex describes the change of attention and focus that can happen during surprises. When you're surprised by something, regardless of what else you're doing or you have on your mind, that surprise momentarily disrupts you. Your attention automatically shifts towards the source and stays there until you've evaluated it. All of these physical adaptations get our blood pumping, make us alert, prepare us for action, so we can handle whatever the unexpected event might bring. And of course, when I was learning about all of these reflexes, my thought was, well, these are the sorts of responses I want for my players. As a developer, I want their attention, I want them immersed, engaged, excited for what's going to happen next, and I want the experience to be a memorable one that sticks with them. This is the power of surprise. Get it right, and the positive player response can be a strong one. Now, the surprise may not present any threat, but the reaction is an evolutionary response to the potential for danger. Historically, those of us who were more quickly able to respond to the unexpected were more likely to survive. Hello, thing with the big teeth that's jumped out from around the side of the cave. I was not expecting that. Do you seem dangerous? Should I run away? And how quickly am I able to work these things out? Of course, surprise can mean fear like this, and the initial response still translates to varying degrees, even when it's not driven by fear. The initial response depends on how big the surprise is. Ever given someone a big, unexpected gift or maybe proposed? Same reaction. When we talk about surprise in the context of this talk, though, we're referring to unexpected in-game events, which are at odds with the player expectations, either those that the game has created or expectations that the player has brought with them into the game. And these sorts of surprises can be designed, and that's what we're concerned with today. The design of surprise is comprised of two main components. Risky little tongue twister in there. I left it in there for danger. Nailed it. Yes. Firstly, the context the surprise is happening in. Where a scenario is ambiguous, players aren't able to draw concrete assumptions about what is happening and what might happen next. This is a context of uncertainty. Conversely, if a scenario feels unambiguous to a player, they find it easier to draw assumptions based on their own knowledge and what has been conveyed to them about the game world. This is a context of certainty, and context is very important. The second part is the event itself and how far it diverges from those player expectations and assumptions, ranging from low surprise, where the event meets reasonable player expectations and occurs within the known possibilities of the game world, through to high surprise, where the event is completely out of scope for the player's expectations and breaks the rules of the game world entirely. Both of these variables create opportunities for us to play with our players. Where there is certainty, we can choose to either resolve the situation in a way that aligns with player expectations or seek to create conditions of surprise by subverting them. like making it snow in the desert. To create uncertainty, we can purposefully remove cues, for instance, by making aesthetic or narrative choices that prevent the player from making their assumptions. The level of discordance then directly impacts the intensity of the surprise. For example, you're playing a point-and-click fantasy adventure game and discover an egg in the kitchen of a house. Given the tiny piece of information I've given you, what assumptions are you already forming about this egg? Is it maybe from a chicken or perhaps a duck if you're bougie, that it is a cooking ingredient, that you might use it to solve a puzzle in some way, perhaps by cooking with it, throwing it at someone or something? And you could probably make these assumptions about the egg with a fair level of certainty because of the context in which you found it. The context would be higher in uncertainty if, say, the egg was found somewhere more unusual that it would be harder to make assumptions about. Perhaps you found the egg in a cave, or you found an egg in a level in Doom. Put it in a different context, and all of a sudden the uncertainty about what is happening increases. So that's the first part. Second part is the degree to which the event diverges from the player expectations. I call it the degree of divergence. Sounds fancy? Yes, I was going for grades. So what if partway through the game, a chick hatches out of the egg? Unusual, but doesn't really stray beyond the realms of possibility and not too far from your assumptions as a player. How about a dragon hatches out of the egg? Whoa, more unexpected, but it's an adventure game, so okay, yeah, still whoa, but pretty cool. If a toaster hatches out of the egg, starting to raise some eyebrows and a few giggles. How about the egg tells you that you've been beaten? Yes. And then boots you out to the main menu, completely breaking the rules of the game world. I don't suppose you thought you'd spend so much time looking at eggs today, but I started and I couldn't stop, so sorry about that. So there are degrees of surprise and discordance, and when you're designing surprising events, you can lean on player expectations and deliberately diverge from them. And that was a goofy example, but there are more subtle ways that we can catch our players off guard. And to do that, we need to understand how our brains create expectations in the first place. This is a huge topic that we're only going to scratch the surface of today, but will hopefully give you some food for thought and maybe some inspiration to go and do some further reading. Your brain tells you stories. Our reactions to the world aren't always knee-jerk responses to what we see and hear. Our brains are constantly and actively interpreting what we perceive based on past experiences, creating assumptions, making predictions, and shaping our expectations. Player assumptions are created and affected by many different things. What we as developers have told them through the design, things like how the controls, the mechanics work, game world and characters, maybe also other things that players do and tell them if it's a multiplayer game, and the player's own knowledge and experiences brought with them from outside, things like what do they already know and expect from the genre? How might they expect people and things to behave based on their cultural experiences? And cognitive and psychological processes. And this one is quite fun. What do you see here? Most people see a triangle laid over 3 circles, but in reality, there's no triangle at all. So what's happening here? This is an example of Gestalt theory stemming from the work of Max Wertheimer. Our minds automatically organize visual elements into a cohesive whole, creating an interpretation based on the relationship we perceive between the objects. The law of closure that we've just seen is an example of how we mentally fill gaps that exist in order to organize and simplify shapes. In this case, to see a second shape in the center. And there are all kinds of other weird, cool things that our brain does with visual information, like we'll usually view items that are physically near each other as a group. So can you feel your brain doing this? This is just a bunch of dots, but our brain tells us there's a relationship between the ones that are closer together, 2 groups. We'll perceive things in the simplest form possible, like here we tend to see a diamond first before circles. The human eye tends to follow a continuous path and follows the path of least resistance when it's looking at shape, and will follow a path until it reaches another path or intersection. We'll also group items together that share visual elements like color, size, or orientation. We assume there is a relationship there beyond its form. And we tend to group objects together that if they're located in the same bounded area. And this principle can actually override all of the others, regardless of similarity. These are some very simple examples of how our brain fills in the gaps where we don't have all of the information to create some assumptions. But we don't just do this with visual information. Our brain also fills in knowledge gaps, creating biases that cause us to place things into perceptual sets. And what we perceive to be true can be affected by all sorts of things like motivational level, emotional state. There's a reason why we shouldn't go to the shops when we're hungry. To help us place things into sets, we develop our own rules about the world that we believe to be true, called schemas. And sometimes our brain gets this right, and sometimes not so much. Think about how a toddler might first develop a schema for a horse. They've learned that a horse is large, has hair, 4 legs and a tail. So when the child first sees a cow, they'll go, horse. The cow fits in with their schema for the characteristics of a horse: large, hair, 4 legs, tail. But once the child is told, hey, this is a different animal, they'll then create a new schema for a cow. Then let's say they see a miniature horse, adorable, but it's small. So this time they say, dog. Once they understand that horses can be large or small, they then go back and modify their mental schema of the horse. And we continue doing this throughout our lives. Back to the thing with the big teeth at the cave entrance. Last time I saw a big thing that looked like that, had big teeth, ate my friend. This isn't that same thing, but it kind of looks like it, so maybe it'll eat me, so I better run away. We have schemas for all kinds of information, including schemas about people, objects, places, even relationships. And all of these ways of processing sensory information and interpreting the world interplay with each other. So let's take a look at the way that some of these cognitive phenomena can operate in practice together to create some powerful assumptions. There's no relationship between these dots other than proximity, but we know your brain tells you there is one. These circles become 2 distinct groups. Let's make our dots people. How does that feel to you? Where's your brain going? Maybe sports, choirs, wall of death. Uncertainty remains pretty high, so assumptions about what they might be doing probably depends a bit upon your own experiences and perceptual sets at this point. However, add in some aesthetic cues to lower the uncertainty. Now we're interpreting these shapes as weapons, and it's starting to feel a bit spicy. What else could we do to lower the uncertainty? Okay, all of a sudden you're ready to rumble. They're about to fight. We're sure of it. And now the player is sure. And it's an opportunity to mess with them. Like I said, this is just scratching the surface. There are many, many different theories in the tools in the toolbox of human perception that we can lean on to design our contexts and events. A few of the fun ones to quickly mention: color psychology. So player assumptions can be created and reinforced through the use of color connotations. For instance, there was a 2022 study by Amari and Murdoch that showed that white pills were associated with greater pain relief and red pills were associated with greater stimulant properties. Although, as we've already touched on, these sorts of color connotations vary between cultures and personal experiences. That's important to be aware of, but still, we can be highly influenced by color. Ever look for your glasses and realize they're right on your head? Inattentional blindness is where the brain selectively filters out what our subconscious believes to be unimportant information. Perhaps you've seen the invisible gorilla test. If not, it's a very famous experiment conducted in the late 90s by Christopher Chabry and Daniel Simons, where participants were shown a video and asked to count the number of times a ball was passed between a group of people. 50% of those people focused on counting the passes completely missed someone running into the scene dressed as a gorilla, beat their chest, and run out again. When we focus closely on one thing, we can miss other things that are in completely plain sight. Wild. So we can use this to do things like put clues right under the noses of our player and distract them and not let them realize their importance until the last second. Your brain likes patterns, especially faces. Pareidolia occurs when you see things that aren't actually there, something that is familiar. So in this case, faces in clouds, in trees, all of that sort of thing. It's called pareidolia. And heuristics is another huge field of study in psychology concerned with the different ways that our brains take mental shortcuts to help us make fast decisions. And one example of this is attribute substitution. Take a look at this question. What's the reflex answer that comes to mind? The answer that most people's brains tell them off the bat is 10 pence, but it's not correct. The cost of the ball is actually 5 pence. The problem requires a bit of complex thinking, and even though we can do the very simple maths to get it right, if we spend a little bit more time thinking about it, there's a simpler problem of chunking that our brain would rather do. It gives you the wrong answer as a knee-jerk for the majority of people. And it's a very strange feeling when you notice your brain doing this. It can make you reflect on your own decision-making with a bit more depth. So, your brain tells you stories, but sometimes it lies. It lies like a cheap watch. And as developers, we can leverage this to design events by sneakily creating assumptions to diverge from, or by minimizing the player's ability to create them in the first place by removing cues. So, on to the second part of the research, the study, where I applied some of these frameworks and learned a bit about when surprise can go wrong. My research was inspired by a 2019 study of music led by Vincent Chung, thank you, Vincent, which I came across as part of my research into surprise. It analysed 80,000 chords from Billboard pop songs to understand what made listeners favour one song over another. It discovered that uncertainty and surprise in musical phrasing had a positive impact on our enjoyment. Specifically, that people most enjoyed music that diverged from expectations in one of two ways, where phrasing started somewhere familiar but ended somewhere surprising, low uncertainty, high surprise, or those that started in an unexpected way but ended somewhere familiar, high uncertainty, low surprise. And you'll see these expressions abbreviated a little bit later in the talk. Professor David Huron, yay, David, lovely man, a researcher in the field of musical cognition, noted that this pattern could also be true of audience enjoyment in other artistic disciplines. So he adapted the model into examples of text to show how it could be translated. Once upon a is a low uncertainty context. We have an idea about what the end of that sentence might be. What would the low surprise answer be? Exactly. We're expecting time. Once upon a time is a low surprise resolution. Once upon a fish would be high surprise. Tailgate political birthday makes it quite hard to guess what might be coming next. But birthday party ends the phrase in a familiar way. And I was looking at this and it occurred to me that there were some similarities here in things that I enjoyed in games. Deviating from expectations in situations of perceived certainty, like a narrative twist at the end of a story where you feel like you know exactly what's going on and then it kicks your ass for you at the last moment, or resolving disparate pieces of information to solve a puzzle or a mystery where things kind of make sense at the end. But Chung's original study also found that music which both started in uncertainty and ended in surprise had a negative impact on the listener's enjoyment. This fine line between positive and negative response was really interesting to me. So I delved into all of this in my research thesis with a blended approach of practice-based research by applying the learnings from the first phase to create some test artifacts, and practice-led, where I hope to contribute something new to the field of game design by conducting a study to go alongside. Study limitations. The results should be considered a jumping off point rather than complete scientific conclusions. This is a study about an art form. Participant numbers are good enough to draw some pretty clear indicators, but differences like player preferences, for instance, have the potential to have a statistically significant impact where participant numbers are, in the tens rather than the hundreds. I'd love to do a bigger study, perhaps with some reduction of the more artistic variables to draw some more concrete conclusions, but that wasn't in scope for this project. This was an MA. So enough chat about what I didn't do. Here's what I did. I built playable test levels of a point-and-click adventure and combined this with a data-driven survey to generate insights. I set out a framework of 4 test levels of varying uncertainty and surprise, aligned to Chung's original study, with 2 points of divergence in each version, one aesthetic, one narrative. My tests were developed as new scenes in a prototype that I had built for an adventure game called Black Metal, a strange and dark story about an angsty demonic teen trying to find out who they are and why they woke up in a boat in the middle of nowhere with a headache and a bent fork. After playing a test level, participants answered a series of questions to understand the impact of the experience on their emotions and actions, specifically aspects of enjoyment, surprise, and immersion. I limited analysis to the core test areas, and I just changed the 2 aesthetic and narrative variables. And I only sent a single test to each participant to try to avoid some of the introspection and interpretation that can happen when people, start to try to work out what the study is about. So I kept it very small. I chose a scenario with high likelihood of being familiar to participants, with a straightforward, easily understood goal. You're trying to get past a bouncer and into a nightclub without any ID, which I obviously never did. For the low uncertainty variants, I worked to create assumptions in implicit and explicit ways, both telling and showing the player what was happening through the visuals, audio, and narrative. I then tested this with a small user group to see if they would draw my intended conclusions before I conducted the study. They did, and this is where I ended up. This is my low uncertainty bouncer. Leaning on Catherine Isbister's theories of the impact of aesthetics and perceptual sets, I designed some pretty concrete cues based on tropes in popular culture. Look at this guy, pretty easy to draw assumptions about their demeanor, likely behavior, job, especially when you put them in front of the image of a nightclub. In a context of uncertainty, a player finds making these assumptions more challenging. They're less able to make sense of what is happening or what might be happening next. A little more difficult. This is my high uncertainty bouncer. No clothes or expressions to give cues, an inanimate object with no specific personality connotations, reducing the number of assumptions that we can make. So now we've created some certainty and uncertainty in the bouncer character placed outside the nightclub. Let's see how we can meet or diverge from player expectations. Now I've got to try and make this work. Yes, ha! Okay, is it a surprise that the bouncer sounds like this?
Can I come in? Sorry, kid, you seem a little, young and innocent for what's in here.
Not so much. What about this?
I'm afraid thou seemeth a little short in the tooth for what is within.
How about if they sounded like that, but looked like this?
The only irrefutable proof of your years since birth will alleviate my doubts.
Or maybe this?
I'm afraid I'm going to need to see some documentation.
Getting a little funnier. Now for the narrative. Bloop. You start the level by recounting that you need to find a beast in velvet. When you find the nightclub, you realize you need to get inside, but you're refused entry. As you explore the level, you talk to some people, fish around in a bin, find an ID, maybe realize you're in the second circle of hell, and then eventually piece together that to present the ID as your own, you'll have to disguise yourself. Bit of chicken grease here, and an eyeliner there, and you fashioned a disguise kit and are ready to try your luck again. Da, 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 da. In the low uncertainty variants, you return to the club disguised and things are how you left them. In the high uncertainty variants, the building is now inexplicably engulfed in pink flames.
What the fire? The whole place, it's burning.
In the low surprise variants, you show your ID, you're adequately disguised, and the bouncer lets you into the club. No problem. In the high surprise variants, you return disguised, but no dice. You're refused entry anyway. Mysterious eyes appear and encourage you to lean into your emotions. Whether you hold back or let them have it, you angrily destroy the bouncer to gain entry. Oops. Now onto the survey, a few notes about the approach. And this can be a bit dry, so I'll keep it brief and high level, but if you'd like the full breakdown, basis for measurements, all of the sciencey bits, please just let me know. I'd be very happy to share the full report, and I'll add my contact details at the end. I asked players about what they felt and did during the experience, starting with open questions that increasingly narrowed in scope. The survey was distributed to 106 participants, and after data cleaning, non-returns, missing values, all of those sorts of abnormalities, I ended up with 47 complete responses. I analysed the quantitative data using a combination of frequency and cluster analysis to identify patterns and trends within each test group. And for the qualitative responses, I used data coding to identify surprise, enjoyment, or presence indicators, and also conducted frequency, thematic, and sentiment analysis. I then compared and compiled my findings across both of the data sets to triangulate and validate my conclusions. Here's what I learned. High surprise events in contexts of high uncertainty negatively impacted the player experience. This was the most concrete finding in terms of the data, and proved to be true in 13 out of 14 of the study measures, so over 90%. The high uncertainty, high surprise test level, which was our Shakespearean aubergine bouncer, returned higher rates of confusion and frustration than the control. And in terms of enjoyment, scored the lowest levels of positive response and the highest levels of negative response in every category where enjoyment factors are rated, not just compared to the control, but also across the other level variants. Here's a little snapshot of a few of the data points that illustrate this. So you can see in the first graph, the high uncertainty, high surprise test, people felt much less positive, much more negative or neutral when rating their experience compared to the control. Less people reported joy as an emotion that they experienced, and people rated their feelings of frustration and confusion more intensely. High frequency themes in the thematic analysis included mixed emotions and ambiguity about what was happening, and frustration when choices seemed to lead to unexpected outcomes. Participants expressed a desire for more agency in their decision making. So to summarize, the study indicated that surprise has a maximum threshold for effectiveness when creating a positive response, and that high surprise events are especially hazardous in contexts of high uncertainty. Reflecting the results of Chung's original findings relating to music, in this study, the high uncertainty, high surprise variant reached the threshold where it had a negative impact. I did some reading around, I looked for a term, I looked to understand what this was called, and I couldn't find a term to describe it, so I made one up. Schema discordance is what occurs when the player is unable to fill the gap between the expectations of the scenario they're in and a subsequent surprising event. In this case, because it's the schema of the narrative that's the source of the mental disconnect, I'd refer to the example as narrative schema discordance. Cognitive overload occurs when a person's processing capacity is reached. Celia Hodent talks about this in The Gamer's Brain, a great book. I'm sure many of you have read it. If not, hard recommend, it's great. In schema discordance, as player expectations get further and further away from what happens, there's a point at which cognitive overload occurs and the player just can't make sense of what's happening anymore. Point of cognitive overload caused by the discordance is different for everyone, but when it happens, it can create frustration, anger, irritation, and all of these came through in higher quantities in the results for the high uncertainty, high surprise test level. But it doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't do it. We just need to manage it carefully. Creating seismic events which break the possibilities of the game world and challenge foundational assumptions we've created in the player is risky, but we all know that when it's delivered well, it can be awesome. You can get a huge amount of satisfaction from these sorts of schema-breaking events if they're carefully managed, and you're able to piece things together. Fight Club, Sixth Sense, Saw, those mind-bending stories where things just suddenly make sense. BioShock fans, would you kindly give me a thumbs up if you know what I'm talking about? If you know, you know. Yes. No spoilers. So I've designed a framework to help people design and assess potentially risky events in their own games. I have this framework and a developer's guide, again, kind of in document form, which I can send you. Please just holler if you're interested. It is designed to be used by completing a section at a time for each critical event that is targeting a positive impact through high surprise. You start by looking at the existing and created assumptions which the player might have when they encounter the surprise. What expectations have they brought into the game with them? And what have you, as the developer, told them? Next, the player's perceived level of certainty about the scenario. How sure will your player be feeling about the assumptions that they've made and what is likely to happen next? And what is the level of surprise that you're looking to create? How far does it diverge from those expectations and rules of the game world? Then you can assess the likely impact. Where the level of surprise is breaking, or the level of uncertainty is high, and the level of surprise is conflicting or absurd, you can consider mitigations to help prevent the negative impacts. By explaining at the time of the discordance, explicitly revealing something new and unknown to the player that either reduces the uncertainty of the context or explains the reasoning for the event. For example, an NPC explains a previously unknown element of backstory before attacking the player. Or you can mitigate by indicating, prior to the discordance, include clues or information which the player can reflect on to draw new conclusions about the scenario or about the event when it happens, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for them to find to help them close the mental gap and get them from where they are to where we want them to be. If the clues are too obvious, the player will see it coming. We all know that. You know, you're watching a mystery and you're like, it's obvious. If the gap remains too large and the player can't make the mental link, schema discordance might occur, and with it, potential for frustration. When I started piecing all of this together in my mind, I remembered occasions where characters had acted in ways I could perceive to be completely off. And even when there are explanations in place, if you don't do a good enough job of closing that mental gap, well, it can leave people furious. Daenerys. And that's the best bit. But I did learn some other things that I'm going to just let you know about. My findings suggested that players are likely to feel surprised by any scenario which strays from expectation, including attempts to introduce uncertainty. Surprise and surprise indicators were reported at consistently lower levels in the control in every survey measure. It's what we would expect, low uncertainty, low surprise. However, interestingly, the study's results showed comparable levels of surprise between the high uncertainty and high surprise test levels. You can see a couple of data points here where surprise was reported in the high uncertainty, low surprise test at very similar levels to the high surprise variance, even though participants also reported higher predictability in that version. So, to avoid creating too much surprise, we should be mindful of how far we're straying from the expectations of the player, even when we're putting them in strange scenarios. Even if the level of action is low, they might still perceive it to be surprising. This conclusion was supported by the qualitative analysis, where surprise appeared as a high-frequency theme. Further research could be interesting to understand all of this a bit better. Firstly, what constitutes uncertainty, what existing theories could be used to inform and validate the design of uncertainty in future studies, or research into the impact of uncertainty on the player experience as a standalone factor. Yes, lots of things interesting to me. But the other thing that the data showed was suspense may be linked to creating a positive player experience and could also be important in achieving immersion. This, again, was less of a concrete finding, but enough there that it caught my attention. The study showed that a lack of surprise led to increased anticipation, which in turn correlated in some of the measures with an increase of reporting in immersion and associated indicators. When I compared levels of anticipation to some of the measures of enjoyment and how the levels compared across all 4 of the test variants, it painted a pretty interesting picture, and again could be a link worth investigating some further research. I also got a raft of useful feedback about the prototype itself, in particular aspects of the UI and UX. Despite incremental usability testing during development, there was some negative sentiment from participants about some aspects of the test levels. This undoubtedly contributed to some of the negative sentiment indicators. However, given its prominence and consistency across all level variants, there was no undue impact on a single test. Everyone knows how excruciating user testing can be, even when your test levels are prototypes built for the purposes of a research piece. But you know what they say, feedback is the breakfast of champions, and I am still full. And on that note, it's quitting time for me too. Thank you very much. I've been asked whether people could rate the session, and you already know I can handle it, and I'm definitely not going to show screenshots of your feedback in future sessions. Have a fantastic conference. Please do come and talk to me now or later or online if you just want to talk about surprise or games or anything else. I love a chat. Thank you. That's all the things. There's 3 minutes. I can try and answer questions, but it might be a bit. I've been chatting for over 40 minutes now. I don't want to. I suspect people might need a little coffee and a sit down after that. So, okay. Thank you.